Hi, my name is Roxana Donishju, and today we're going to talk about how pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic pathways are informative when studying the pharmacogenomics of warfarin. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about warfarin. Warfarin is an anticoagulant, and it's given to anyone who has a risk of having a thrombus event. So individuals who have had prior deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, atrial fibrillation, or artificial heart valves. Between individuals, there can be as much as a 20x variability in the dose that's needed to get the same therapeutic response. This dose is affected by drug-drug interactions, environmental influences, and, as has been recently discovered and characterized, genes. Currently in the clinic, most individuals guess and test. So they'll give a dose of warfarin, then they'll look at how well the individual is being anticoagulated, and then they'll take either the dose up or down. However, it's very important to dose people correctly, because if you underdose individuals, you have the danger of a thromboembolic event, which is why they're on warfarin to begin with. And if you overdose on warfarin, then you experience one of warfarin's adverse events, and it's not a good one. It's bleeding, and because of this adverse event, warfarin's actually on the list of top 10 drugs with ER adverse events, because people get a dose that's too high for them, and before that dose can be adjusted, they have a bleeding event and end up in the ER. So, how can we figure out what genes influence warfarin dosing? Well, one way is to turn to the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic pathways. The pharmacokinetic pathways are involved in the processing of warfarin, how it's metabolized by the body and then eventually eliminated. The pharmacodynamic pathways have to do with how warfarin acts on the body, where it binds, what pathways and genes and targets it influences. Here, we're looking at the pharmacodynamic pathway of warfarin. So we're looking at what warfarin's target is and the downstream genes and products that influence that it influences. And actually, when individuals were first studying genetic variants that can influence warfarin, they turned to this pathway and said, do we see any variants in this pathway that seem to affect warfarin dose? And in fact, they found variants in VKRC1, the target of warfarin, that are now linked to warfarin resistance and warfarin sensitivity, depending on what kind of mutation it is. If the mutation doesn't allow warfarin to bind, then you're warfarin resistant. If you have a mutation that affects the expression of VKRC1, you can be warfarin sensitive. There have also been mutations in CYP4F2 that have been linked to requiring a higher dose of warfarin. And you can see that CYP4F2 is involved in the processing of vitamin K. And so if you have an issue with that processing, you need a higher warfarin dose. This is the pharmacokinetic pathway of warfarin. So this is the pathway involved in warfarin metabolism and elimination. And one of the major metabolizers is CYP2C9, which you can see here. And genotypes in CYP2C9 have been connected to warfarin dose. So if you have the star 2 or star 3 variants of warfarin, your CYP2C9 doesn't process warfarin the same way as the wild type. And so you might actually have a sensitivity to warfarin, and you're likely to have a sensitivity to warfarin because the warfarin is actually not metabolized at the same rate as it does in the wild type. So when a normal person is given the dose of warfarin, you have an expectation that metabolism happens at a certain rate. When individuals with these variants are given warfarin, that metabolism happens at a slower rate, and so they're actually more sensitive to the drug's effects because it sticks around longer. These genetic variants have been taken into account and been used to create a pharmacogenetic algorithm that takes both clinical and genetic factors into account in order to help predict what kind of dose an individual starts with. And this is kind of where you see how these pharmacokinetic pathways and pharmacodynamic pathways have not only been useful in discovery, but are now useful in application. And in this next slide, you can actually, if you have the information about your genetic variation, calculate what your own warfarin dose would be. So this is the algorithm, and for fun, you could go ahead and do that. I, for one, know that I am a slow metabolizer of warfarin, and so my dose predicted by this algorithm is actually lower than what the clinical starting dose usually is. So I hope you have found this interesting, and thank you very much.